The evening Vernon Marsh rode into Elkridge, I was elbow-deep in dishwater at Hargrove's boarding house, counting pennies in my head. That's the kind of arithmetic you do when you're a black woman alone in a Colorado mining town in 1883. You know exactly how many meals you've served, exactly how many cents sit between you and the next month, and exactly how far the nearest city is if everything falls apart again. I'd been in Elkridge for 9 months, long enough to learn which miners tipped their hats and which ones didn't bother looking at me at all. Long enough to know that Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the boarding house with an iron spine and a surprising absence of prejudice, would let me sleep in the back room as long as I worked double shifts without complaint. And long enough to know that the man who came down from the mountain every other Thursday, the one the whole town just called Cade, was not someone who invited conversation. His full name was Elias Cade. That much I'd gathered from Mrs. Hargrove, who'd known him longer than anyone in town and still didn't claim to know him well. He had a cabin past the tree line on Granger's Ridge. He trapped. He hunted. Twice a month he rode into town on a gray mare that looked half wild itself, bought flour, salt, ammunition, coffee, and occasionally a book from the general store. He spoke to almost no one. When he did speak, it was the kind of voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than his chest, low and unhurried, like a man who'd decided a long time ago that words cost something and he wasn't going to spend them cheap. I'd served him supper exactly 4 times. Each time he'd sat at the corner table by the back window, eaten without rushing, left coins that were always more than the meal cost, and walked out. Once, setting down his plate, my hand had brushed the edge of his, and I'd pulled back like I'd touched a stove. He glanced up, just for a second, with eyes somewhere between gray and green that carried the weight of a man who'd seen things he didn't talk about. Then he'd gone back to his food, and I'd gone back to the kitchen, and that was the whole of it. I need to tell you about Vernon first, because that's the part that explains everything. His name was Vernon Marsh, and I'd been with him for 3 years back in Independence, Missouri. I'd left him 11 months before any of this happened, and for a while, I believed that leaving was enough. That you could cut a thing clean and it would stay cut. Vernon was the kind of man who makes sense at the beginning. Noticed things. Remembered what you said about your mother's peach cobbler. Brought the exact ribbon you'd admired once at the dry goods store. You think, this is what it feels like to be truly seen. What I didn't understand until it was almost too late was that the seeing wasn't tenderness. It was inventory. By the end of our 2nd year, I couldn't visit my cousin without accounting for every hour. When I finally said, I can't do this anymore, Vernon, he sat very still and said, you'll come back. Not anger. A fact. I took a train west with $40 sewn into my coat lining, changed my name from Josephine to Josie, and kept moving until I found a town small enough to disappear in, and high enough that the air felt like a locked door between me and everything I'd left. For 9 months, I'd been careful. Learned which roads led out of town fastest. Noticed when strangers lingered too long at the general store. Kept my hair different, kept my head down, kept my voice low. I thought I'd buried my trail deep enough. It was a Thursday in late October. The kind of evening when the cold comes down off the peaks early, and the wind through the valley sounds like the mountain exhaling. I was clearing supper dishes. Mrs. Hargrove had gone to bed early with a headache. 2 miners playing cards by the fireplace, a cattle buyer reading a newspaper in the corner. Ordinary evening. Then the front door opened, and the cold that came through it wasn't just weather. Vernon stood in the doorway, thinner in the face, trail dust on his coat, but that expression, pleasant and settled, like a man who'd done all his thinking on the ride over, was identical to the one I remembered. My hand stopped. The plate I was holding suddenly weighed too much. I set it down because I was terrified of dropping it and drawing his attention with the sound. Too late. His eyes found mine, and the smile that spread across his face was the thing I'd been running from for 11 months. The smile of a man collecting something that belonged to him. There she is, he said, almost fond. Like I was a horse that had wandered from the corral and he'd finally tracked my prince to the right ridge. You need to leave.
Now, Josephine. My real name, like a key in a lock. I rode for 100 miles. You're going to at least let me talk. He was moving toward me. Vernon always moved through a room like it owed him passage. The miners glanced up, glanced back down. You've been dramatic, he said, that word, the one he always used to fold my reality in half until it fit inside his. Come outside, we'll talk. He reached for my arm. His fingers closed around my wrist, not hard enough to bruise where anyone would see, but firm enough to say I own this. I made a sound. Not a word. Something raw and involuntary, caught between my throat and my teeth. Now, if you're already invested in Josie's story and you want to find out what happens when a mountain man decides that what he's watching isn't something he can walk away from, take a second and hit subscribe. Mountain Rescue Hearts is built on stories like hers, women who find their strength in the wildest places and the quiet men who stand beside them when it counts. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let's get back to it. And at that exact moment, I heard the scrape of a chair against the wooden floor. I hadn't known he was there. Elias Cade had been sitting at his corner table in the shadow where the lamplight didn't reach, and I'd walked past him twice that evening without seeing him. That was the thing about Cade, he could fill a doorframe when he stood, but when he chose stillness, he became part of the room the way a stone becomes part of a river. He stood up. Not fast, the way a man stands when he has no intention of sitting back down until something is finished. Vernon's hand was still on my wrist. Cade looked at it. Then at Vernon's face. The look lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, I watched a man decide something and not waver. Let her go. 3 words. He didn't raise his voice. The room heard him the way a room hears close thunder. Vernon turned. I watched the calculation behind his eyes, size, threat, whether he could talk his way around it. Elias Cade stood 6'3", firelight catching the hard lines of his face, hands loose at his sides in the way of a man who's used them for things other than kindness. Vernon's arithmetic came up short. He released my wrist. This isn't your concern, friend. Vernon said in his reasonable tone, she told you to leave. I'd listen. This is between me and, it isn't. Cade took 1 step forward. Just one, but it closed the distance in a way that made the room shrink. Not anymore. Vernon straightened his coat. This isn't finished, Josephine, he said, and the promise in his voice was the kind that lives under your skin for days. Then he walked out. I gripped the serving table with both hands, feeling my heartbeat in my wrists where his fingers had been. The miners went back to their cards. The cattle buyer turned a page. The world resumed its ordinary noise like nothing had cracked open in the middle of it. Elias Cade was standing 5 feet away. You all right? He asked. I almost said yes, the reflex, the one women learn to give. Then I stopped. I will be, I said instead. He nodded, looked toward the door, then back at me with something that wasn't pity and wasn't discomfort. Something more direct. Something that said, I see what this is. He's not leaving town tonight, Cade said. No. He's not. A pause. Then, lock the doors, all of them. I'll be outside. You don't have to. I know I don't, he said. He took his hat, put it on, and walked into the October dark. I locked every door in Hargrove's boarding house, front, back, side, root cellar. Checked the windows. Put out the lamps. And when I finally stood at the upstairs window of my back room, looking into the dark where the mountains were just a blacker shape against the sky, I saw him. Elias Cade. Sitting on the porch rail, still as the timber posts on either side of him, rifle across his knees, watching the road. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed with the quilt pulled up and my boots still on, listening to every sound the boarding house made, settling wood, wind in the eaves, the occasional creak that could have been a footstep or could have been nothing. When the first gray light came through the window, I went downstairs. The porch was empty, but on the top step, a tin cup with the last cold swallow of coffee still in it. Next to it, 3 cigarette butts stamped out neat. He'd been there all night. Mrs. Hargrove found me in the kitchen an hour later, already started on the bread. She took one look at my face and set down her shawl.
Something happened, she said. Not a question. Mrs. Hargrove didn't waste words on questions she already knew the answers to. I told her enough. A man I used to know. He found me. He's not the kind who goes quiet. She was silent for a long moment. Then, Cade was outside all night. I know. He doesn't do that, she said. In 7 years, I've never known that man to do anything that didn't serve his own solitude. You understand what I'm telling you. I understood. I just didn't know what to do with it yet. Elias came to the boarding house that afternoon. Walked through the front door, which was unusual. He typically slipped in through the side. He found me restocking the linen shelf. He was at Pickett's saloon last night, he said without preamble. Asking about a woman who works here. Using your real name. The shelf suddenly needed every ounce of my attention. I folded a towel with hands that didn't shake because I told them not to. My cabin's up on the North Ridge, he said. Not easy to find if you don't know the trail. And I know the trail. I looked at him. Tall, weathered, hands rough and still at his sides. Those gray-green eyes watching me with something that wasn't pity, and wasn't charity. The steady attention of a man who'd measured a situation and decided where he stood. I'm not going to run from him, I said. Running is all I've done for a year. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to choose better ground. That landed differently than I expected. Choose better ground. Not fleeing, repositioning. Think fast, he added. Then he put his hat on and walked out. He was right, and I knew it before sundown. Vernon was seen twice more that day, at the general store asking Mr. Petty about the black woman at the boarding house, and on the back road, just standing there, looking up at the windows the way a man looks at a door he's already decided to walk through. I packed what I owned into a single canvas bag. 11 months of a new life, and it still fit into something I could carry with one hand. Cade was waiting at the edge of town with 2 horses. He handed me the reins of a chestnut mare with a calm dark eye and said, "She'll follow mine. You don't need to do much." The ride up took over an hour. The trail climbed through aspen groves that had turned gold, the last bright thing before winter stripped the color from everything. Higher, aspens gave way to spruce and pine, the air thinned and sharpened, and the sounds of town fell away until there was nothing but hoofbeats and wind through the trees. His cabin sat on a shelf of land overlooking the whole valley. 1 room and a loft, built from logs fitted with the care of someone who intended to stay. A porch facing west. A woodpile stacked with precision against the north wall. A stream I could hear before I could see. Inside, a stove, a table, 2 chairs. And along one wall, the thing that stopped me. A shelf of books. 30, maybe 40. Whitman. Shakespeare. Something in French I picked up and held before setting it back. You read French? I asked. Some, he said, and didn't elaborate. That first evening, he cooked. Venison stew with wild onion and potatoes. We ate across from each other, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who'd each learned to exist without filling every quiet with sound. After supper, I stood on the porch. The town was invisible from here, just a faint suggestion of lamplight, and beyond it, the mountains against a sky turning the deep blue that only happens at altitude. How long have you been up here? I asked when he brought coffee. 6 years. Alone? He handed me the cup. Our fingers touched. Neither of us pulled away. There was someone, he said. Before. A long time before. The days that followed had a rhythm I hadn't expected. Not the rhythm of hiding, the rhythm of living, just somewhere higher. He showed me the land, where the stream ran clean, where the deer trails crossed, which slopes caught morning sun. He moved through the woods the way Mrs. Hargrove moved through her kitchen. Long practice, every step intentional. On the 3rd day, he took the rifle off the wall and held it out. You should know how to use this. I've never fired a gun in my life. That's why. In a clearing east of the cabin, tin cans on a fallen log, he taught me. Stock firm against the shoulder, cheek against the wood, breathe out before the squeeze. His hands positioned mine, efficient, careful, and I was aware of the warmth of him and the smell of wood smoke in his coat. I missed 3, clipped the 4th, Not the fifth clean off the log. You're a natural, he said. Beginner's luck. Luck doesn't hold a rifle that steady. By week's end, 4 out of 6 at 30 yards. It wasn't just the skill. It was holding something that gave me range, reach, consequence. For 3 years, Vernon had made sure I understood that the distance between us was his to control. Now I had something that redefined distance on my own terms. One evening, the 5th or 6th night, he told me about Catherine, his wife. Fever in a settlement near Bozeman, 8 years ago. He told it plainly. No embellishment, just the facts and the geography of what came after. Selling a small house, drifting west, climbing into higher country until the silence was big enough to hold what he was carrying. I didn't come up here to heal, he said. I came to stop pretending I was fine. Did it work? His expression was, for the first time, entirely unguarded. It did, but it took longer than I wanted. I told him then, the whole of Vernon, not the shorthand, the full shape. 3 years of being rearranged from the inside, of having my perceptions questioned until I questioned them myself. The night I packed with hands shaking so hard I could barely tie the straps. The 11 months since, and the exhaustion of building a life while looking over your shoulder. He listened the way the mountain held weather, completely, without flinching. He taught me not to trust what I knew, I said. That's the part I haven't gotten back. You knew enough to leave, he said. You knew enough to come here. You're the first person who said that like it was enough. Because it is. If this story has you holding your breath the way Josie held hers on that porch, hit that like button. And share this with someone who believes the strongest kind of love starts with standing guard. Mountain Rescue Hearts has more stories where this came from, and your support is what keeps them coming. Now, back to the ridge. I stood to clear the plates. He stood at the same time. We were close, closer than the cabin required, and neither of us moved. The fire cracked. Wind moved outside. His hand came up slowly, carefully, and touched the side of my face the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to reach for. I leaned into it, just slightly, closed my eyes. He let his hand drop a moment later and took the plates without a word. But something had declared itself in the room without needing to be named. The next morning, one of Mrs. Hargrove's stable boys rode up the trail with a message. 3 men had arrived in Elk Ridge the previous night, asking for Vernon Marsh by name. One carrying a shotgun openly, the way men carry weapons when they want the carrying to be a statement. Vernon had been spotted with them at pickets, asking about a woman. A black woman who worked at the boarding house. The boy's face was gray under the trail dust. Mrs. Hargrove says they rode toward the north road this morning. They was asking about a cabin on the ridge. I looked at Elias. His expression had gone very still, the kind of still that isn't calm, but is what comes right before something that isn't calm at all.
How many hours ago? 3, maybe 4. He looked at the tree line below us, then at me. Go inside, he said quietly. Get the rifle. And far below, faint but unmistakable in the thin mountain air, I heard what he'd already heard. Hoofbeats. Coming up the trail. I didn't go inside right away.
My feet moved to the edge of the porch instead, and I stood there with the mountain air sharp in my lungs. And those hoofbeats getting louder, and something in me, the same something that had packed a bag 11 months ago, the same something that had gotten on a westbound train with $40 and no plan, decided. Not again. Not on this ground. Then I went inside and got the rifle. Elias was already loading his own. Rock outcrop 40 yards east, above the clearing, he said. You can see the whole trail. Take the ammunition. You want me up there. I want you where you have the advantage. You can shoot. You proved that all week. Now show them. Not a request, not an order. Acknowledgement that I was part of this. I took the rifle, the cartridges, and the blanket he pressed on me. The rock's cold, you'll shake, and you can't afford to, and I climbed. The outcrop gave me a clean view of the trail, the clearing, and the porch where Elias now stood alone. 4 riders came through the last pines. Vernon in front, always in front when someone else carried the risk. Behind him, 3 hired men. Broad, armed, the kind who've learned their size has market value, and stopped asking questions about how it's spent. Vernon smiled at Cade on the porch. That smile, the one that had tracked me 400 miles,
I told you this wasn't finished. And I told you to leave, Cade said, same gravity, but with an edge now. Josephine. Vernon called toward the cabin. Come on out. This doesn't need to get ugly. My real name on this mountain landed like a fist. But I was 40 yards east and 20 feet up, flat on cold granite, with the rifle steady. She's not coming out, Cade said. Vernon glanced at his men. One dismounted, then another. Hands moved toward holsters. If you've been riding alongside Josie this whole time, this is the moment. Leave me a comment, would you have pulled that trigger? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next mountain rescue heart story. Let's finish this. Think carefully about what comes next, Cade said from the porch, hand resting on his rifle stock. A fact, not a threat. There's one of you, Vernon said, the reasonable mask thinning enough to show what was underneath. And I brought 3. You miscounted, I said. My voice came from above and behind them. All 4 heads turned. Vernon's face, I will remember it for the rest of my life, went through 3 things in one heartbeat. Confusion, recognition, and something I had never, in 3 years, seen on him before. Doubt. I was standing on the outcrop. Rifle at my shoulder, steady the way Elias had taught me, breathing out slow the way he'd shown me in the clearing with the tin cans. I wasn't aiming at Vernon. I was aiming at the ground 2 feet in front of his horse, because Elias had taught me that a warning shot does its best work when it lands close enough to feel personal. I fired. The crack split the mountain air open. Vernon's horse spooked hard. The hired men froze, not because of the shot, but because of where it came from and what it meant. They'd been told about one man and one woman who couldn't fight. Nobody had mentioned the granite shelf, or the rifle, or the woman who'd spent a week learning that distance was something she could own. Next one won't be a warning, I said, and my voice sounded like someone I was still becoming. One of the hired men looked at Vernon, looked at the ridge, looked at Cade on the porch with the easy posture of a man who'd been quietly hoping for exactly this outcome. This ain't worth the money, the man said, already backing toward his horse. We had a deal. The deal didn't include getting picked off a ridgeline by someone who can aim. He mounted up. The other 2 followed. There's a particular quality to purchased loyalty, it evaporates the instant the math stops working. Vernon stood alone.
His men threading back through the pines. His horse drifting away, refusing to come. Every advantage he'd ridden up with dissolving around him. He looked up at me, for the first time since I'd known him, through 3 years of having my reality rewritten, through 11 months of running, through 2,000 miles he'd crossed because he believed he was entitled to. Vernon Marsh saw someone he did not recognize. Josephine, my name is Josie. And you're going to get on that horse, ride back the way you came, and never say either name again. You wouldn't. Try me.
The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. Wind through pines, the creek below, the mountain holding its breath. Vernon got on his horse. Cade didn't move from the porch until Vernon disappeared into the trees and the hoofbeats faded to nothing. Then he sat on the step, set the rifle across his knees, and looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on him. He was proud. I climbed down. My hands were shaking, not cold, just the spent electricity of what had just happened. When I reached the porch, he stood. You miscounted, he said, repeating my words, and there was something in his voice that might have been laughter in a man less practiced at containing himself. It worked. It worked, he agreed. Then I sat on the step and cried. Not sadness, something older and deeper. The release of a weight carried so long I'd forgotten its shape. 11 months. 3 years before that. Every room scanned for exits, every night calculating whether I was far enough. Done. Elias sat beside me, didn't touch me, didn't speak, solid as the ridge. Until the storm passed on its own schedule. What now? I said when it had. Now we tell the marshal. The law was slower than the mountain, but necessary. Marshal Briggs took my statement and sent riders before nightfall. They caught Vernon at a way station 2 days later. Mrs. Hargrove testified, Mr. Petty testified. Even the cattle buyer, who I'd assumed noticed nothing, gave a written account. I hadn't known the town had been paying attention. That the people I'd spent 9 months serving had actually seen me, in the way small towns sometimes do, quietly, until the moment it matters. Vernon was sentenced to a year in the territorial prison and barred from the county. It wasn't the length that mattered. It was that someone had called what he'd done by its name. The weeks after were the quietest I'd known in years. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The silence that settles when something heavy has been set down and you're still adjusting to the lightness. I went back to Hargrove's, I went back to work. But something had shifted, in me, and between Elias and me, and neither of us pretended otherwise. He came to town more often. Not daily, he still needed his mountain and his silence, but enough that Mrs. Hargrove stopped commenting and started setting an extra plate without being asked. We were careful, not the careful of fear, but of people who know what they're building is real and deserves the time it takes. He didn't ask questions he hadn't earned, I didn't offer more than I was ready to give. For the first time since Vernon, I was deciding what I was ready for, at my own pace, without someone at my shoulder rewriting my conclusions. One evening in early spring, snow pulling back from the slopes, the creek running fast with meltwater, I rode up to the ridge with supplies and a question I'd been turning over for weeks. Mrs. Hargrove wants to retire, I said, standing on his porch with the valley greening below. She offered to sell me the boarding house. He leaned against the rail. Can you manage it? I've been managing it 6 months already. She wants to make it official. That almost smile, the one that never quite completed itself but meant more than most people's full grins. Then you should. I'd be staying in Elk Ridge permanently. The evening light was turning the snow on the peaks gold and rose. His face was more open than I'd ever seen it, unguarded in a way he'd only been once before, at that table, telling me about Catherine. I know, he said. Would that be all right with you? He reached out and took my hand. Not the way Vernon used to, not to hold or claim. The way you take someone's hand when you're asking them to walk beside you and you want them to know they can let go anytime. Open palm, no grip. A choice, not a verdict.
Josie, he said, my name, the one I'd made real by choosing it. I've been hoping you would. I laced my fingers through his rough hands, scarred knuckles, hands that had built shelter from raw timber and kept watch through an October night and touched my face once in the lamplight like something he didn't want to break. I bought the boarding house that spring, renamed it.
Learned to run a business the way I'd learned to shoot. Steady hands, better aim than anyone expected, and the understanding that distance is something you define for yourself. Elias kept his cabin, his books, his mornings alone with the mountain. But most evenings he came down, and most nights my porch held 2 chairs instead of 1. I used to think what happened in Elk Ridge was a rescue, that a man came down from a mountain and saved me. I believed that for a while, and it would have been a clean story to keep telling. But that isn't what happened. What happened was that I ran until I found ground worth standing on. And when the thing I'd been running from followed me there, I didn't run again. I climbed a ridge, steadied a rifle, and held my ground. And a man who understood what it costs to choose ground stood beside me on it. Not in front of me, beside me. Some things, when they come to you in the wild places, don't arrive as rescues. They arrive as doors. And I walked through mine with my own 2 feet, a rifle I'd taught myself to trust, and the certain knowledge, earned, not given, not borrowed, that I was never going to let anyone lock it behind me again.